We all know the legend, the name that echoes across 8 centuries. Genghis Khan, the scourge of God, the savage from the steppe who forged an empire from blood and bone, who built pyramids of skulls and carved a path of destruction so vast it reshaped the world. But this is a lie. Not the conquest, not the empire, but the idea of the man. We see a barbarian king, a force of nature, as if he simply erupted from the dust fully formed. We are asking the wrong question. It is not who he was, but what made him. The truth is far more terrifying and far more calculated. Genghis Khan was not born a conqueror. He was manufactured. His children were not raised. They were engineered. The greatest military machine the world had ever seen did not start on a battlefield. It started in a nursery. This is not a story of a lone genius. This is the story of a system, a brutal, unforgiving, and brilliantly effective laboratory that took children and forged them into the rulers of a continent. This is the story of the Golden Cradle, the factory that built an empire, and the childhood it consumed to do it. To understand the nursery, you must first understand the world that demanded it. Forget the opulent palaces of Rome or the fortified cities of Europe. The Mongolian steppe is a beautiful, but brutally unforgiving, crucible. Winters that freeze flesh in minutes. Summers that scorch the earth to dust. A land that offers no gifts, only temporary reprieves from suffering. Here, survival was not a right. It was a skill, honed daily against hunger, rival tribes, and the indifferent fury of nature. Sentiment was a luxury that got you killed. Weakness was a contagion that doomed your entire family. In this world, a child was not just a future adult. They were a future asset or a future liability. There was no middle ground. This philosophy of ruthless pragmatism began at the very first breath. From the moment a child of the Borgigian clan, Genghis's bloodline, was born, the conditioning began. Historical accounts and persistent legends speak of a chilling ritual. Newborns were not coddled in swaddling clothes by a fire. They were washed in cold water, sometimes even in snow. This was not abuse for its own sake. It was the first, most fundamental test. It was a biological screening. Would the infant's heart strengthen, its lungs deepen, its will to live ignite in the face of hardship, or would it falter? For the Mongols, it was better to know immediately if a child lacked the resilience to survive the life that awaited them. The steppe would only get harsher. This was merely the introduction. There was no room for the fragile. The survival of the tribe, its future warriors, its future leaders, depended on a constant, ruthless selection for the strongest, the hardiest, the most adaptable. Childhood, as a concept of protected innocence, did not exist on the steppe. There was no time for prolonged play or idle fantasy. As soon as a toddler could walk, they were given tasks. They learned to tend to the flocks, to handle a knife, to understand that every living thing, from the sheep they herded to the horse they rode, had a purpose tied to survival. They slept in jairs where the conversations were of battle, betrayal, and strategy. They absorbed the politics of power and the consequences of failure not as stories, but as immediate realities. A missed sign of a rival tribe's approach could mean death. A poorly tied knot on a saddle could mean a fatal fall. There was no buffer. This constant immersion was the second part of their education. The world is not safe, and your vigilance is the only thing that will keep you alive. This was the world Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, was forged in. A world where his own family was cast out to die on the steppe, where he killed his own half-brother for control of the family. He didn't just survive this crucible. He learned its deepest, darkest laws. And when he built his empire, he codified them. He turned the random, brutal lessons of the steppe into a systematic program. The wild wasteland became a blueprint for building the perfect, unsentimental ruler. The steppe provided the raw material children hardened by survival. But resilience alone does not build a world empire. Genghis Khan understood that to rule the earth, his heirs needed more than a tough spirit. They needed a specific, lethal skill set. And so, the childhood of a Mongol prince became a curriculum, a relentless education built on 4 brutal pillars. The first pillar was not taught. It was ingrained. A Mongol child was placed on a horse almost as soon as they could walk. For them, the saddle was not a tool. It was a second cradle. Their world was not measured in steps, but in strides. This was not for play or leisure. This was to forge a bond so deep it became biological. The horse was an extension of their own body, their source of mobility, their status, their lifeblood. They learned to eat on horseback, to sleep on horseback during long marches, and to tend to their mount before tending to themselves. A warrior without his horse was a dead man. This lesson was branded into their consciousness before they could even form the words. By the age of 5 or 6, they were expert riders, their small bodies moving in perfect, fluid sync with their animals. They could control the horse with their knees, leaving their hands free for the tool that would become their voice of authority: the bow. The second pillar was the art of the hunt. But for a Mongol prince, the hunt was not a sport. It was a rehearsal for war. Their first bow was a small, light thing, but the discipline required was immense. They practiced for hours, their small fingers growing calloused, their shoulders strengthening with each draw. The ultimate goal was not to hit a stationary target. It was to achieve the impossible, to fire a composite bow with pinpoint accuracy while at a full gallop. They learned to knock an arrow, draw, and release in the chaotic, bouncing suspension between a horse's strides. They learned to lead a target, to account for wind, to become a mobile, unstoppable platform of death. This transformed their hands from those of a child into instruments of precise, long-range killing. It taught them patience, timing, and the cold calculus of trajectory and force. The whistle of the arrow became their first language of command, a message of doom that could be delivered from hundreds of yards away. The third pillar was the most psychologically complex: the warrior's spirit. And it was forged not against straw dummies, but against each other. The sons of Genghis Khan, Joki, the eldest, Chagatai, the fiery, Ogdi, the diplomatic, and Talyui, the fierce, were constant rivals. They were pushed into brutal physical contests. Wrestling, mock sword fights with wooden blades, and races where coming in second was a mark of shame. This was not simple sibling rivalry. It was state-sponsored conflict, engineered by their father. Genghis Khan watched these contests closely. He was not just looking for the strongest. He was mapping their personalities, their alliances, and their weaknesses. He famously pitted them against each other, asking riddles of strategy to see who answered fastest. He would assign them joint commands to see if they could overcome their animosity for a common goal. The message was clear: your brother is your first and most important rival. To best him is to prove your worth, but to alienate him completely is to weaken the entire empire. It was a brutal, high-stakes game where the prize was their father's favor, and the penalty for failure was obscurity. This constant friction was designed to crush any nascent softness and reveal the natural hierarchy of power. The fourth and final pillar was the most privileged: the education of the mind. While European princes were tutored in Latin and scripture, the heirs of Genghis Khan received their lessons in the Council of the Felt Walls, inside the command tent. They were required to sit in silence, absorbing everything. They listened as their father and his generals, the brilliant Subutai among them, planned real campaigns. They heard debates on logistics: how many spare horses per warrior were needed for a march across the Khwarezmian Empire. They learned diplomacy by observing envoys from foreign lands, understanding how to read bluster and fear. They studied the art of the feigned retreat, the importance of psychological warfare, and the strategic value of a well-timed massacre. This was not theory. It was live-fire education. A mistake in this tent would later be paid for in blood on a battlefield 1,000 miles away. They learned that war was not about brute force. It was about intelligence, speed, deception, and an overwhelming, coordinated application of violence. By the time they were given their first independent command, they had already witnessed the dissection and conquest of a dozen nations from the most exclusive classroom in the world. This was the complete curriculum: the rider, the hunter, the warrior, the strategist. For pillars that took a child of the steppe and forged them into a master of the world. A sharp mind in a strong body was still not enough. The final and most crucial stage of education was the forging of a specific mentality: a Mongol mind. Beyond the skills of combat lay a deeper curriculum, one designed to shape their very values, their desires, and their understanding of power itself. This was the software installed on the hardware they had spent years building. The first and most sacred principle was the cult of loyalty. In an empire spanning thousands of miles and hundreds of cultures, what held it together? The answer was a single, unbreakable chain of command with the Khan at its apex. This was not a vague ideal. It was a rigid, uncompromising law. From their earliest days, the children were taught that loyalty to the tribe and the Khan superseded everything. It was more important than personal ambition. It was more important than brotherly affection. It was, in many cases, more important than their own lives. This was the glue that transformed individual warriors, and often rival princes, into a single, cohesive fighting force. A soldier who abandoned his comrade was executed. A commander who failed his orders was disgraced or killed. But a warrior who demonstrated unwavering loyalty, like the legendary General Subutai, could rise from the lowest ranks to the highest circles of power, regardless of his birth. The children saw this. They learned that fidelity was the ultimate currency, the one virtue that could forgive all else. This cult created a level of trust and operational reliability that their fractured, backstabbing enemies could never comprehend. The second psychological pillar was perhaps the most counterintuitive, the weaponization of humility. The Mongols, who plundered the wealth of continents, were taught to despise luxury. They watched as their father, the most powerful man in the world, lived a life of deliberate austerity. He slept in a felt tent, wore simple practical clothing, and ate the same food as his common soldiers. This was not poverty. It was a calculated ideology. They were taught to view the sedentary luxury of the Chinese, the Persians, and the Russians as a kind of sickness, a softness that rotted ambition, dulled the senses, and made empires weak and complacent. A full belly made a warrior slow. A soft bed made him reluctant to march. An attachment to finery made him fear the dirt and blood of the battlefield. For the young princes, this created a powerful cognitive dissonance. They were conquerors of unimaginable wealth, yet they were forbidden to indulge in it. This discipline ensured they remained connected to their steppe roots and the source of their power, their hardness. It was a constant reminder that what they could do, conquer, was infinitely more important than what they could acquire. The final lesson was the most chilling: the cold, calculated application of terror. The Mongols were not merely brutal, they were bureaucratic in their brutality. The children were not shielded from this. It was a core part of their strategic education. They learned that a city annihilated was a message sent to the next 10 cities. A pyramid of skulls was not a testament to rage, but a tool of psychological warfare. A graphic cost-benefit analysis delivered in bone said, "Surrender immediately, and you may live under our rule. Resist, and you will be erased from the earth. The choice is yours." The princes observed how their father would often spare artisans, scholars, and those who submitted without a fight. They saw that the violence was not random. It was a calibrated instrument. The goal was to break the enemy's will to fight before the first arrow was even loosed. They learned that fear could travel faster than any horse, that it could crumble walls without a single siege engine, and that it was ultimately more efficient than any weapon in their arsenal. This completed the Mongol mind, a psyche built on loyalty to the tribe, humility to maintain their edge, and the strategic use of fear to dominate their enemies. They were no longer just skilled warriors. They were philosophers of power, psychologists of conquest. They had learned that to rule the body of an empire, you must first command its mind. The ultimate test of any system is its results. And the graduates of Genghis Khan's brutal nursery did not merely inherit an empire. They exploded it. They became the living, breathing proof that the system worked with terrifying efficiency. First came Ogidi Khan, the chosen successor. Not the strongest warrior, but the shrewd diplomat and administrator his father had groomed. He was the system's validation, proof that strategic sense was prized over pure brute force. Under his command, the Mongol war machine perfected its logistics, launching coordinated invasions across multiple fronts that crushed the Jin dynasty and pushed deep into Europe. Then, the next generation, Batu Khan, a grandson, a product of the same rigorous training. He led the legendary Golden Horde that submerged the Russian principalities, leaving cities like Kiev as smoldering ruins. His campaign into Eastern Europe struck fear into the heart of Christendom, proving the system could produce capable commanders for generations. And the ultimate testament, Kublai Khan. He completed the conquest of China, a feat that had eluded every steppe nomad before him. He did not just conquer. He transitioned from a Khan to an emperor, founding the Yuan dynasty and ruling from the magnificent capital of Dadu, modern-day Beijing. He was the perfect hybrid, a Mongol warrior king with the strategic vision to govern one of the world's most complex civilizations. He was the system's masterpiece. But the very engine that powered this success contained the seeds of its own destruction. The system was a double-edged sword. The same competitive fires that Genghis Khan stoked in his sons, the sparring and rivalry in the Golden Cradle, did not extinguish with his death. They intensified. The empire was ultimately divided not by external enemies, but by the internal fractures between these four branches of his family. The same lessons in unwavering loyalty to one's own faction that created unity now bred bitter civil war between them. The very strategies they learned at their father's knee were now turned against each other. The Mongol Empire, at its peak, began to tear itself apart along the fault lines of the rivalries its founder had so carefully and so fatally cultivated. The system was brilliant. It produced a dynasty of unparalleled conquerors. But it could not solve the ultimate problem of power, that the same qualities which build an empire are often the very ones that shatter it. The Nursery forged the weapons that won the world, but it could not teach them how to rest in the same sheath. So, what are we left with, standing in the quiet echo of their ruins? The true genius of the Mongols was not just in their armies, but in their ability to industrialize leadership itself. They cracked the code. They created a system, a brutal, unforgiving, and horrifyingly effective system that could reliably mass-produce masters of war. It was a factory for genius, running on a fuel of hardship, rivalry, and psychological conditioning. This forces upon us a deeply unsettling moral question. Was this brutal conditioning a necessary evil? Was the price of a world empire, the shattered childhoods, the mercilessness, the oceans of blood, a price worth paying? Or did this system, by its very nature, create a self-consuming cycle of violence, where the only possible outcome was eventual self-destruction, the empire tearing itself apart along the very fault lines it engineered? The haunting legacy of the Golden Cradle is that it holds up a dark mirror to our own notions of power and how it is made. It forces us to ask the age-old question with terrifying new clarity. Are leaders born, or are they forged? And if they can be forged, what are we willing to sacrifice in the fire to create them? The wind on the steppe still carries the whisper of their answer, that the line between building a ruler and breaking a human is terrifyingly thin. And once crossed, it changes the world, leaving behind empires of dust, and a warning carved not in stone, but in the human soul. The story of the Golden Cradle is a chilling lesson in the price of absolute power. It shows us that history's greatest empires were often built in the cradle, with methods that shock the conscience. This leaves us with a final question for you. Can true, lasting greatness ever be built on a foundation of calculated brutality? Or does that brutality inevitably become the empire's tomb? We want to hear your judgment. Share your verdict in the comments below. If this journey into the dark heart of the Mongol war machine captivated you, then you won't want to miss our next investigation. We delve into the shadows of another empire to uncover a forgotten secret. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you don't miss it. Until then, remember, the past is not just a story, it's a warning.